Well, that's a first, having to go to a backup game 2 weeks in a row. The intended game to cover this week was Gunmetal, a late 90s game for both DOS and Windows, but I just couldn't get the game working properly. Well, not that I couldn't get it working at all, and in fact, it seemed to be working right for the first little while. But then I made progress in it and found some severe problems I couldn't find solutions to. So I had to cut my attempts to fix it short, otherwise I would have ended up without a game to cover this week. So instead, today's ancient DOS game is a simple text mode platformer known as Labyrinth of Zeux. It sounds familiar, doesn't it? In fact, it kind of sounds like it might be related to the MegaZeux game creation system. And you'd be right. Labyrinth of Zeux was created before MegaZeux, and a lot of what you see in this game actually served as the foundation upon which MegaZeux was built. Which is kind of weird, really, when you consider that MegaZeux runs from an overhead perspective by default, and Labyrinth of Zeux is a side perspective. Although MegaZeux is so flexible, you could just create platformers with it. In fact, from what I've seen here, it's safe to say you could remake the entirety of Labyrinth of Zeux in MegaZeux itself. And I can even confirm that that has actually been done. But as for this game, it's pretty basic, though a lot more challenging than it may seem at first, especially if you're going to try to beat it without using its saving and loading mechanics, as it plays more like an action puzzle game than a straight up platformer, with many of the levels having very specific movements and actions that you need to perform to survive, while others are a bit more traditional and boil down to just surviving the enemies and hazards. And simple stuff. Labyrinth of Zeux was created by Software Visions back in 1993 by the same person responsible for MegaZeux, and is a one-player platformer. Graphically, the game runs in a heavily modified 80 by 25 text mode. However, because of all the modifications it's doing, you need an EGA card at the minimum for it to render properly. Though if you have a VGA card, it'll also do palette modification tricks too, for fading effects. As for audio, it supports the PC speaker for sound effects, and either the AdLib or Sound Blaster cards for music. As for its current release date, it was made freeware way back in 2003, even though the game itself and its documentation contained no traces of such a decision. But given that everything else MegaZeux related eventually went freeware, it's not surprising. There's actually a bunch of different places you can grab the game from online nowadays, but since it's MegaZeux related, I'm going to go ahead and recommend the Digital MZX website at www.digitalmzx.com. As for physical copies, I don't doubt a few exist out there still, but they would likely be just very unassuming discs hiding away in people's old disc holders. But whether that's worth anything or not nowadays really just comes down to if it's an older version or not, since the older versions of the game don't seem to be archived anywhere. Only the last version, 2.21, which was released in 1996. There is a story to the game, but it's super simple. You play the role of a famous theologist known as Vince M. Lewis, who's on a quest to find one mystical object he has yet to encounter, the Silver Staff of Zeux. You thus descend into the caverns of Zeux in an attempt to locate it, only to find yourself trapped by a cave-in as soon as you enter the caverns in the first level, thus committing you to the quest. Now, for anyone who's played a platformer designed in the MegaZeux GCS, the controls and gameplay here might actually feel very familiar. You can move left and right, and you have a jump button, plus you can drop bombs, which will appear directly in the same tile space as your character, and won't begin to count down to explosion until you move. Now, there's breakable objects, pushable objects, a variety of enemies and slimes, colored keys to pick up and use them to open doors. It's pretty uncanny just how much this feels like a MegaZeux platformer, despite being made before MegaZeux. However, this means it also has some of the same quirks. For instance, achieving precision with long jumps can be pretty difficult, since even if you press both jump and a direction together, mere milliseconds of difference can result in one of those getting processed for the next frame of gameplay, and the other having to wait until the frame following. Thus, anytime you attempt such a jump, you'll either jump as intended, be one tile behind because you jumped first and started moving following, or will end up walking off the edge you intended to jump from first and subsequently fail to jump since it was processed too late. As such, it takes a lot of practice to get used to jumping here, but then the same applies to every platformer ever made in MegaZeux. To help with this though, you can adjust the game speed, which is calculated out pretty much the exact same way it is in MegaZeux, with the lowest speed number being equivalent to a completely unlocked frame rate going as fast as possible, and every speed value above adds one vertical retrace to the delay per frame. I'll talk more about dialing in a good speed setting around the end of the video. It's interesting though that the music in the game is using CMF Creative Music format files, as this wasn't a very common sight for games, as evidenced by the fact that MegaZeux uses module music files instead. Well, that said, I have a question here asked by one of my Patreon supporters, ZZT, who asks, was the title screen music in Labyrinth of Zeux used in another DOS game? I swear I'd remembered hearing it before, the first time I had ever started up Labyrinth. Now, I wasn't able to find a definitive answer to this question, but when you see that many of the music files included with Labyrinth of Zeux predate the game by a variable amount of time, from 1 to 3 years, it's pretty safe to say none of the music included was designed specifically for this game, and likely came from a compilation or such. In fact, pulling from compilations of mod files was extremely common for MegaZeux creators, and since very few people were trying to profit off of MegaZeux game creation, it generally wasn't considered a faux pas to be doing this, unless the author of a particular tune was explicitly stating not to distribute their music outside of whatever CD collection or BBS it was found in. Back on the gameplay though, this game is 50 levels deep, and you're going to find after just the first few levels that the difficulty skyrockets due to 3 key factors. Now, the first is that many levels will just flat out kill you if you don't start solving them immediately, due to the movement of enemies or other such things. The second is that many levels will now start to feature sections which require precision movement, which is difficult to accomplish given how sensitive the controls are. But if you were to reduce the control sensitivity, then they'd still be difficult anyways for the opposite reason. Precision should not be a life or death factor in a text mode platformer. Here we are. The third reason though is far more insidious. Random chance. When you have level designs which are steeped in puzzle solving, random chance should not be a factor in clearing them, because this means even if you do everything right, you might still lose. A level 4 here is a prime example. In order to get the key in the top right section, you need to be able to push a rock close enough to be able to use it as a literal stepping stone to get the extra height needed for a jump. But there's only one rock in the entire set that can be pushed close enough, which requires you to bomb other nearby rocks first to be able to push it. However, there's missiles being launched at random. Missiles which can explode under the right conditions, potentially right next to the one and only rock that you can use to make the jump. Yeah. Suffice to say, attempting to clear this game straight without using the saving or loading mechanics is hard enough, but throwing in random chance means even if you know what to do and are very consistent with doing it, you might still get screwed by the RNG. But fortunately, since the game was inspired by ZZT to an extent, the saving and loading works in a very similar way, recording the exact state of the game when the save is made. So you can save right at the start of a level, or even right before trying to tackle something dangerous or random. Well, there's 4 save slots available, and what I was typically doing was using save slot 1 to save the state as soon as the level began, and then using the other slots for when I needed to clear tricky sections. In fact, you can buffer the save and load keys during the level transition delay or the death delay. Though if you do it that way, you have to be careful not to hit any movement or jump controls until the save or load actually happens. Otherwise, you'll interrupt those buffered keystrokes. I do have a few tips though for everyone who wants to try this game out. The first is an obvious one that you're going to find out very quickly, but it's something you always need to keep in mind. Things can crush you. Boxes, bombs, freaking gold, anything in this game that conforms to the laws of gravity will crush the player if it lands on them. This means if you have a stack of boxes or boulders or whatnot, and you attempt to push one of the lower ones out of the stack, you will instantly die. So don't do that. My next tip is very pertinent to avoiding death as well, in that enemies can only kill you in one of 2 ways: if you actively run into them, or if your character moves into the tile directly in front of an enemy. This means you need to be paying attention to the directions the enemies are moving in, and to position yourself in a way that the patterns that those enemies follow will not put you in their immediate path. But it also means avoiding jumping into their path too, even if they're stationary. Now, some enemies can be touched without being directly killed by them, such as the flying bombers, but most enemies are deadly. Another big tip is to find key press patterns to survive otherwise difficult sections. For instance, going back to level 4 again, you can get across most of these vines simply by holding right and up together. But there's 2 parts, the very start of the sequence and in the middle where 2 spikes are on the ceiling sandwiching a full set of vines, where you have to let go and position yourself properly, then hold right for a single frame before holding up again. Finding ways of manipulating your key presses to achieve simple victories will greatly help you if you intend to attempt saveless runs, or if you need to go through particular sections again and again. And many times, it's not that hard to figure stuff like this out, and just takes some trial and error. My final tip is to not be afraid to try wild ideas, because many times, the wild idea is the solution. For instance, here in level 17, you actually have to jump off of your own lit bombs to clear the seemingly impassable mountains that are in your way. Or here in level 23, you have to get past 3 bombable walls, and are given 3 bombs to work with, but you can only actually get up there with 2 bombs remaining. So instead, you have to make a path for the missiles to follow so that they can curve around and hit those walls for you. Overall, Labyrinth of Zeux is interesting and really helps to give an idea of where MegaZeux was coming from in its design, given the creator's initial fascination with ZZT, leading to this, leading to MegaZeux. It's hard for me to call Labyrinth of Zeux good, because the level design is both amazingly clever and horribly inconsistent at the same time. Yet the save load features help to mitigate the frustration that comes from that. Just like with Commander Keen in Goodbye Galaxy, saving and loading exactly where you want to is kind of a band-aid solution in the place of better level design, and undercuts the entire point of having extra lives. But again, this all doesn't make the game bad either. But still, all that said, Labyrinth of Zeux is definitely worth trying out at least once, especially with it being freeware now. But at the same time, it's not something I'd say is worth coming back to over and over again. I mean, there is a level editor you can use, so you could always remake the game in your own image, but if you wanted to go that far, I'd say just go use MegaZeux instead. So when I first started playing this in DOSBox, I had cycles set to auto and was running at an internal speed setting of 4, and that seemed to run pretty well, but some of the more computationally complex levels later in were killing the frame rate. So to get things more consistent, I ultimately decided on a cycles count of 30,000 with an internal speed setting of 6, remembering that the internal setting is slower at higher numbers. Now, this did affect the bonus counter countdown sound effect, but that was a small price to pay for having a more consistent frame rate. Just like with many MegaZeux games, there's no correct speed setting, so feel free to adjust all of this to your own preference. Anywho, that'll be all for this episode of Ancient DOS Games. Next week's a filler, and I'm going to be discussing something that happened more recently that I'm sure everyone wants to hear my thoughts on, so I will absolutely provide them, so be sure to tune in next Saturday to see and hear some of my thoughts on it all. Thanks for watching, everyone, and extra special thanks to everyone supporting me on Patreon. Here's just a small selection of you guys.